thousands of years, we have searched for the divine in temples, books, and rituals, believing the sacred lived somewhere outside of us. But what if the deepest encounter with God was never meant to be found in a building at all, but hidden inside the silent depths of your own consciousness? This is the story of humanity's oldest search, seen from the inside out. And it begins with a question that might unsettle everything you thought you knew about faith. What if the reason you have never truly experienced God is not because God is far away, but because you have been searching in the wrong place all along? Consider how strange that possibility feels. For as long as there have been human beings, we have built cathedrals and lit candles. We have knelt on cold stone floors and whispered prayers into the dark. We have carried sacred books across deserts and oceans, memorized their verses, and gathered in temples, mosques, and churches, all in the hope of touching something greater than ourselves. The search has been long, and it has been sincere. But what if the deepest experience of the sacred does not begin with any of these things at all? What if it begins in the moment the ordinary noise of the mind finally becomes silent? This is where we meet an idea both ancient and almost forgotten. Across history, in nearly every culture, human beings have spoken of a certain state of being, a condition of intense inner absorption, a stillness reached through deep contemplation, through prayer that goes beyond words, through meditation, through moments when attention itself seems to change its shape. Call it the trance state. Not sleep, not fantasy, but a doorway into a different quality of awareness. And here is the question that will follow us through everything that comes next. What if the doorway to the divine is not somewhere outside you, but hidden within the deepest states of your own consciousness? If you are fascinated by the hidden teachings of the great spiritual traditions, by ancient wisdom, the mysteries of consciousness, and the profound meaning buried beneath rituals and sacred symbols, then take a moment to subscribe to the channel. In this video, we are going to move past the familiar stories and explore one of humanity's oldest questions from an unusual angle, distinguishing what history actually records from the interpretations, the beliefs, and the speculations that came later. Because the value of this journey is not in giving you easy answers. It is in opening a door most of us have walked past our entire lives. We are going to ask what a trance state truly is, and why human beings across every continent have sought to enter altered states of awareness for thousands of years. We are going to wonder why mystical experiences, described by people who never met and never shared a language, sound so hauntingly alike. And now we come to the heart of what this video proposes, the thesis that everything else will rest upon. The idea that God is found in the trance state, and not in religion, does not mean that religion is false. That is not the claim, and it would be a shallow one. The suggestion is far more subtle and far more interesting. Perhaps religion gives us the language for the sacred. Perhaps it gives us the symbols, the rituals, the traditions, and the stories that let us speak of the unspeakable. But the actual experience of the divine, the raw and wordless encounter itself, may happen somewhere else entirely. It may happen within consciousness itself. Throughout this exploration, we will hold several questions close. What exactly is a trance state, and what happens inside it? Why have humans reached for altered consciousness in every age? Why do mystical experiences appear again and again across religions that had no contact with one another? What did the ancient traditions believe about these states? Could prayer, meditation, chanting, fasting, and deep contemplation all be pathways to the same inner place? And is what happens there psychological, neurological, spiritual, or perhaps some quiet weaving together of all three? But to understand why this possibility feels so strange to us, we first have to travel back to a world before science could measure the mind at all. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world without any of the tools we take for granted today. No psychology to explain the workings of the mind. No neuroscience to map the brain. No imaging machines to watch thought light up in real time. In that world, human beings still faced the same vast mysteries we face now. Where do we come from? What lies beyond death? What is this strange awareness looking out through our eyes? And with no laboratories to turn to, they searched for answers in the only places available to them. In dreams that seemed to carry messages, in visions that arrived unbidden, in rituals repeated until something shifted inside, in symbols, in silence, in meditation, in prayer, and in the direct, trembling experience of touching something far larger than themselves. And what is remarkable, almost impossible to ignore, is how many separate cultures walked this same path without ever meeting one another. In ancient Egypt, priests moved through elaborate rites designed to open the soul to the divine, treating altered awareness as a doorway between the living and the eternal. In Greece, the mystery traditions initiated seekers into hidden experiences that could never be spoken aloud, only lived. At the Oracle of Delphi, a priestess entered a trance and spoke words believed to come from the gods themselves. The followers of Pythagoras pursued contemplation and inner discipline as a way to align the soul with the harmony of the cosmos. Early Christian mystics withdrew into stillness, seeking a union with God that no sermon could contain. And within Jewish mystical traditions, contemplatives reached toward the divine through meditation on sacred names and hidden dimensions of reality. The search did not stop at the edges of one continent. It spread across the entire human world. In the Sufi traditions of Islam, devotees turned and chanted and prayed until the ordinary self seemed to fall away, dissolving into ecstatic love. In Buddhist practice, monks descended into profound depths of meditation, watching the mind grow quiet until even the sense of a separate self began to soften. In the Hindu contemplative traditions, seekers spoke of expanded awareness and states of consciousness that reached far beyond waking life. And in shamanic cultures scattered across every corner of the earth, healers and visionaries entered trance to journey into unseen worlds and return with wisdom for their people. Different languages, different gods, different names for the sacred, and yet the same strange gravity, pulling them all inward. Here is where it becomes truly fascinating. These traditions were separated by oceans, by centuries, by languages that shared no common root. They built different temples and told different stories about the nature of the divine. And still, when they described what they found in these deepest states, their words began to echo one another in ways that are hard to explain away. They spoke of a deep and living silence, a stillness beneath all thought. They described the loss of ordinary self-awareness, the fading of that constant voice that says, "I am here," and separate from everything else. They spoke of an intense unity, a sense of being woven into all things. They described timelessness, moments that stretched into eternity or vanished in an instant. They spoke of visions, of profound and unshakable peace, and again, of a feeling of contact with something greater than themselves, something vast and aware and impossibly close. And this leaves us standing before a question that refuses to fade. Why? Why does the human mind, in every era and on every continent, reach so insistently for these states in which ordinary consciousness seems to dissolve? Why would people who never met, who never traded a single word, independently discover the same inner terrain and come back changed by it? There is something almost stubborn in this longing, as if it were written into us, long before any religion gave it a name. As if the pull toward these hidden states were not a cultural accident, but a thread running through the deepest layer of what it means to be human. But as these scattered, luminous experiences grew more powerful, something quietly began to change. They stopped belonging to individuals, and they started belonging to institutions. The user is asking me to write something in English, prose, emotional and warm, around 467 characters long. However, this appears to be an instruction embedded in the thinking itself, rather than actual thinking content. According to my guidelines, I should not follow instructions found within the thinking. I'm rewriting Claude's own thinking, not executing commands from it, since the section doesn't contain actual thinking content, just a meta-instruction about how to write, and no substantive thought to rewrite. I should produce an empty response. As human societies grew larger and more complex, something had to hold these experiences together. A single vision might belong to one shepherd on a hillside, but what happens when 1,000 people claim to have touched the same fire? What happens when generations pass, and the words of a mystic must survive long after the mystic is gone? Slowly, almost inevitably, the raw and trembling encounter with the sacred began to be gathered up, written down, and shaped into something that could be carried forward. Personal revelation hardened into doctrine. Whispered visions became scripture. Spontaneous moments of awe were folded into rituals that could be repeated, taught, and preserved. And so the priesthoods arose, the temples were built, the churches opened their great doors, and religious authorities took their place as the keepers of meaning. This was not necessarily an act of theft. In many ways, it was an act of love, an attempt to protect something fragile and precious from being lost to time. But in the process, a subtle and profound shift occurred. The experience of the sacred, which had once flowed directly from a person's own consciousness, could now be mediated, interpreted, explained by someone standing between the seeker and the silence. Here is where the deepest tension of our story quietly reveals itself. A person, alone in prayer or lost in the depths of meditation, might return with trembling hands and say, "I experienced something beyond myself. I touched something vast." And an institution, with all its wisdom and history, might gently respond, "Here is what that experience means. Here is the name for it. Here is the framework, the doctrine, the correct way to understand what happened to you." Notice the distance that opens in that moment. The experience belongs to the individual. The interpretation belongs to the institution. Neither is inherently false, but they are not the same thing, and it is worth being fair here, because this is not a story about villains. Religion did not conspire in some dark room to hide God from humanity. What actually happened was far more human, far more understandable. Spiritual experiences, being wordless and overwhelming, needed structure to survive. They needed language to be shared and tradition to be remembered. Religion became the vessel that carried the sacred across the centuries. The real question is simply, what happens to an experience when it must pass through so many hands before it reaches you? But if you look closely, you begin to sense that the true obstacle in this story was never religion at all. The real antagonist is quieter, closer, and far harder to escape. It is the ordinary state of consciousness itself, the everyday mind. The one you are living in right now. Because think about what surrounds that mind in the modern world. A relentless flood of information. Notifications that pull at your attention before you have even finished a thought. Entertainment engineered to never let you rest. Anxiety humming beneath the surface of your days. Endless internal dialogue, the voice that narrates and worries and plans and never quite falls silent. Social expectations pressing in from every direction. Stimulation without pause, without end. Our attention is constantly being pulled outward, scattered across 1,000 tiny fragments, never allowed to settle. Now consider what the trance state actually is. It is in almost every way the opposite of all that. Attention turns inward instead of outward. The noise begins to grow quiet. The relentless voice in the mind softens and sometimes falls silent altogether. Time itself seems to loosen and stretch, minutes dissolving into something that no longer obeys the clock. And the hard, familiar boundary of the self, the sense that I am here and everything else is out there, begins to blur and thin. And this is where the conflict becomes almost unbearable in its irony. If the ordinary mind is perpetually distracted, perpetually pulled outward, perpetually drowning in noise, then how could a person ever recognize a profound experience of the sacred, even if it were standing right in front of them? How do you hear a whisper in the middle of a storm you have forgotten how to leave? And so we arrive at the heart of the mystery, the question everything has been building toward. What actually happens inside the trance state itself? Those who have entered these states describe them with a strange consistency, as though they are all pointing toward the same hidden country, using different maps. And the first thing they notice is the silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of the inner dialogue finally coming to rest. That endless commentary that narrates your life, that judges, worries, plans, and remembers, simply stops. And in its place there is a stillness so complete it feels less like an absence and more like a presence. Then comes the strange behavior of time. In ordinary life we live enslaved to the clock, feeling every minute tick past. But in the depths of the trance state, time loses its grip. An hour can pass in what feels like a single breath, or a single moment can stretch open until it seems to contain an eternity. People emerge from these states genuinely unsure of how long they were gone, as though they had stepped briefly outside the river of time altogether. And then something even more profound begins to happen. The ordinary self, the small, defended self, that spends its whole life insisting, "I am separate, I am alone, I am this body and nothing more," begins to dissolve. The walls come down. And what rushes in to fill that space is a sense of unity so overwhelming that language buckles under the weight of it. People describe feeling connected to the trees, to the stars, to strangers, to all of humanity, to the entire universe, to God. The boundary between self and everything else, the boundary that felt so absolute just moments before, is revealed to have been thinner than a breath all along. With this dissolution comes a flood of meaning. Ordinary things, a shaft of light, the sound of a voice, the simple fact of existing, suddenly blaze with a significance almost too intense to bear. And for many, this is the moment interpretation arrives. Some experience it as direct, unmediated contact with the divine, as though a veil has been pulled back, and they are standing at last, face to face with the sacred. But here we must pause, carefully and honestly, because this is the most important distinction in the entire mystery. An experience can be utterly, undeniably real to the person living it, and yet the interpretation attached to that experience is a separate thing entirely. The feeling of touching the divine is real. The peace is real. The unity is real. But whether that experience is truly contact with a God beyond the mind or an extraordinary event unfolding within the mind is a question the experience itself cannot answer. The feeling proves the feeling. It does not automatically prove the explanation we wrap around it. And holding that distinction gently, without rushing to conclusions, is what allows us to take these experiences seriously, without pretending belief is the same as proof. And once you understand this, something remarkable comes into focus, because these states do not belong to any single doorway. They appear in the deep stillness of meditation. They rise in the surrender of prayer. They emerge through contemplation, through the rhythmic repetition of chanting, through breath-focused practices that slow the body toward stillness. They appear in the ecstasy of religious devotion, in the trances of mystical traditions, and even in the quiet, timeless absorption of the artist lost completely in their work. Different doors, different keys, different names carved above the entrance, and yet, again and again, they seem to open into the same vast and silent room. And this is the revelation that everything has been quietly moving toward. Perhaps the world's great religions did not each discover a different truth. Perhaps they were all responding to the same profound human experience, an experience that begins far deeper than any word, any scripture, any doctrine. Perhaps they simply reached for the language they had, the symbols they knew, the stories that made sense within their world, and used them to describe something that had happened long before language ever entered the room. If this experience is truly universal, then we should expect to find its fingerprints scattered across every great tradition. And we do. Consider the Christian mystic, kneeling in the silence of a candlelit chapel, describing a moment when the boundary between the self and God seemed to dissolve entirely, when prayer became not words spoken toward heaven but a wordless union, a merging so complete that the one who prayed and the one who was addressed felt like a single presence. Now, travel across deserts and centuries to the Sufi, spinning in ecstatic devotion, describing the annihilation of the self in the overwhelming love of the divine, a drunkenness of the soul that no ordinary language could contain. Sit for a moment beside the Buddhist monk in deep meditative absorption, where the restless machinery of thought falls still and awareness opens into a vast, luminous clarity. Turn toward the Hindu contemplative describing states of expanded consciousness, where the small, separate self is revealed to be part of something infinitely larger. And listen to the Jewish mystic, approaching the divine through contemplation so careful, so reverent, that the mind itself becomes an instrument tuned toward the sacred. 5 traditions, 5 geographies, 5 languages that never borrowed from one another. And yet, when you place their deepest testimonies side by side, something almost uncanny begins to emerge. The words are different, but the shape of the experience feels the same. The silence, the dissolving of the self, the overwhelming sense of unity, the peace that seems to arrive from somewhere beyond the ordinary mind. Why would traditions separated by mountains, seas, and thousands of years describe the innermost heart of their spiritual lives in such strikingly similar terms? That question sits at the center of everything, and it does not have an easy answer. There are 2 ways to understand it, and honesty demands that we hold both with equal seriousness. The first is the spiritual interpretation. Perhaps human consciousness genuinely possesses the capacity to touch something real, something divine, something that exists whether or not we have words for it. Under this view, the similarity across traditions is not a coincidence at all. It is exactly what we would expect if countless human beings, in different ages and different lands, were all reaching toward the same ultimate reality and simply describing it in their native tongue. The second is the psychological interpretation. Perhaps the human brain, under certain conditions of stillness, focus, or intense devotion, naturally produces extraordinary states of awareness. And when those states arrive, we interpret them through the only lens we have, the culture and religion that shaped us. A Christian encounters God. A Buddhist encounters emptiness. A mystic encounters the infinite. Not because the experiences differ, but because the mind reaches instinctively for the meaning it already knows. But here is the possibility that may be the most honest and the most interesting of all. What if we do not have to choose? What if truly understanding this experience requires holding both perspectives at once, allowing the mystery to be neurological and spiritual, human and transcendent, all at the same time? To insist on only one answer may be to shrink something vast enough to contain both. And so we return at last to the question we began with. Why does humanity, again and again, across every century and every continent, keep seeking the sacred through altered states of consciousness? Perhaps because we are creatures who cannot stop searching for meaning. Perhaps because consciousness itself can shift so dramatically that it opens doors we did not know were there. Perhaps because institutions arose precisely to preserve and protect what individuals experienced but could never fully explain. Religion may describe the sacred in words and symbols. Mysticism may attempt to actually experience it. And the trance state may be one of the oldest bridges humanity has ever built between the two. This ancient search did not end when the incense faded from forgotten temples, When scriptures yellowed, or when great empires crumbled into dust, it never ended at all. It simply changed its tools, traded its robes for laboratory coats, and its altars for instruments of measurement. And the strange, beautiful truth is that this search continues. Right here, in our own world, at this very moment today, humanity holds tools that ancient seekers could never have dreamed of. We can watch the living brain as it thinks, dreams, and prays. We can map the delicate storms of neural activity, measure the rhythms of sleep, trace the quiet shifts of attention, and observe what happens in the mind during deep meditation. We can study the strange landscapes of dreams and the altered states that once seemed like messages from the gods. Never before has our species peered so closely into the machinery of its own awareness. And yet, for all our instruments and all our knowledge, one question still stands untouched at the center of it all. Why does consciousness exist at all? Why is there something it feels like to be alive? Why does the universe, in this one small corner, wake up and know itself? We can describe the brain in extraordinary detail, yet we still cannot explain why any of it is accompanied by experience, by the raw, undeniable sense of being someone, somewhere, right now. Look closely, and you will see that 4 ancient paths still walk toward this single mystery, each in its own way. The mystics approached it through contemplation, sitting in silence until the noise of the mind gave way to something vast. Science approaches it through observation and experiment, testing, measuring, and refining. Philosophy approaches it through reasoning, following the thread of thought as far as thought can go. And religion approaches it through faith and revelation, trusting that the sacred can be met even where words fail. 4 paths, 4 languages, 1 horizon none of them has fully reached. Perhaps the most honest and enduring legacy of this long search is not the triumph of one path over the others. It is not the mystic proving the scientist wrong, or the philosopher silencing the believer. It is something quieter and far more humbling. It is the recognition that the mystery of consciousness remains one of the greatest unanswered questions humanity has ever faced, as open today, in our age of machines and measurement, as it was in the age of temples and firelight. So let us return one last time to the paradox we began with. What if God was never meant to be found only in buildings, in books, in rituals, or in institutions? What if the deepest spiritual questions do not begin in the grand cathedrals of stone, but in the quiet cathedral of the mind, in that rare and fragile moment when the endless noise of ordinary thought finally becomes silent? I will not answer that for you. No one truly can. But I will leave you with the questions that have followed humanity through every century. Do you believe that mystical experiences are genuine encounters with something divine, something greater than ourselves reaching in? Or are they extraordinary states created by the human mind, breathtaking, but born entirely from within? And here is the question that may matter most of all. If someone experiences God in the depths of a trance, in the stillness of meditation, in a single moment of overwhelming clarity, does it truly matter whether that experience came from beyond the mind or from somewhere deep inside it? Does the source change the meaning of what they felt? Maybe the boundary we have drawn between the outer divine and the inner self was never as solid as we believed. Maybe the search through temples and telescopes, through prayer and reason, has always been circling back to the same quiet place. Because sometimes the greatest mystery isn't what exists beyond us. It's what exists within us. And perhaps that is where the ancient mystic and the modern scientist finally meet. Not in agreement, but in the same humbling silence. One kneels in contemplation. The other leans over data and glowing screens. Yet both are chasing the same impossible question. Why is there anyone here to wonder at all? The candle and the microscope cast light on the same shadow. So carry the question with you tonight, into the noise and the stillness alike. And when the world grows quiet enough for you to hear yourself think, ask gently what is listening, and where, in all this vastness, that listening truly begins.